Hey guys, today I'm going to be talking about a very important topic that my team faced and went through. It was a challenging time for us where we decided to do something that was not really a popular opinion. And the topic that I'm going to talk about is adopting GraphQL in a legacy Node.js API. And I'm going to walk you through the chronology of what we went through and the challenges we faced and the tool set, the toolkit that we used. So moving ahead, so before we start, I just want to give a brief intro about myself and my organization. So I am a front-end architect working at Tesco Technology. So Tesco, basically, for people who don't know, is the largest retailer in UK and one of the largest in the world. And we have like thousands of shops around the world, brick and mortar shops, and also we have obviously online shopping, which basically accounts to around millions of transactions. And we serve, like I said, millions of customers a week, both store and online. And so if anyone is interested to explore opportunities with us, there's a link that you can see on my slide. So you can just maybe take a screenshot or a snap of it, and you can visit this link and explore more opportunities with us. So that's about me and Tesco. Moving ahead. So before we start, it is very important for me to give a background of what the problem was when we tried to approach it. So we defined the problem statement. Obviously, what you see here is just a condensed form of the problem statement because we've had multiple informal and formal discussions behind this to reach this problem statement basically. So if I had to talk about the problem statement, the general problem statement that we wanted to solve with this was to iteratively migrate to an orchestration layer. I'll explain why we've called it the orchestration layer, which is more maintainable, schema driven, performant, and more opinionated in its architectural decisions. So this basically is the condensed form of all the problems that we wanted to solve with our new GraphQL API, if I can call it that. So this is the general problem statement. Now it's very important when you have a problem. Obviously, at the end of the day, when you work in an enterprise, you are serving business, and it's very important to segregate the general problem statement that you have into a business problem and a technical problem. So then what we did was we went and broke it down into two parts. So the problem statement, when we broke it down into a business problem, now this is the part where we basically discussed and understood with business that what was business going to gain from this migration that we were planning to do. So business was not really worried about changing the tech stack in any way, but one thing that they came back, and that is very important I guess with any business that runs, is they wanted iterative migration. So they didn't want us to do big bang releases and follow a waterfall model. They wanted to be more agile, and similarly the engineering team also wanted to be more agile. We wanted to do more frequent releases during the migration journey rather than stacking up all the new endpoints and then doing a big bang, which obviously for multiple reasons can work, but we prefer not to do it. So the ask from business was just iteratively migrate and avoid big bang releases. Now that was the business problem. Now obviously to solve the business problem, we broke it down and we basically defined the technical problem as well. So this is very similar to a generic problem statement. That's why you'll see some basic jargon reused here. But basically what from technical standpoint, what we wanted to do was we wanted to build a schema driven, a maintainable, and a performant API. And the last bit here is the most important one, why we went ahead with whatever solution we chose, was we wanted an architecture on our Node.js API, which was more opinionated. So that was very important. And the reason that's very important for us, and maybe for any team that is choosing to migrate to GraphQL, is the toolkit that you have around, or the ecosystem that you have around GraphQL is opinionated. Now, obviously, there are situations where you don't want to hook into an opinionated architecture, but we felt that saving time on not deciding what the core architectural decisions are going to be with our Node.js API, in this case our GraphQL API, was more important for us. And that's the reason we wanted to choose an approach which was more opinionated, or a tool which was more opinionated in its ways of working. So then, having defined the business problem and the technical problem, we broke it down into 7 facets or 6 facets. So I think this is again the same jargon, but it's important because we basically looked at this as a checklist. So what this meant was we wanted to reach each of these goals or blocks that you see here. So for example, more releases was important, business schema documentation was important, it had to be easy to test, which I didn't mention previously, but definitely when you're doing a migration, you have to make sure that you don't break existing system, but also your migrated endpoint is easy to test. Performance visualization was also important for us because as an engineering team, and also to give the confidence to business that the migration has not impacted our current APIs in any way. Opinionated, I've spoken about that a bit. I'll cover that more in the subsequent slides. And definitely easy to debug. We definitely, from a legacy Node.js API standpoint, this was the biggest challenge for us. So we wanted a toolkit or an ecosystem which was easy to debug, and when we get production issues, we didn't have to spend a lot of time to figure out what was going wrong. So having broken it down, now obviously now this is something that was from a problem statement perspective. We defined this problem statement, we broke it down, but obviously we already, like I said, we had a Node.js API that was already serving our application needs and also was live and was serving the customers. So there was obviously some technical stack that was built around the Node.js API. This is, I would call this like an external hooks that or middlewares that we had already built around our Node.js API. So for example, when we dug deep to see what all needs to be adhered to or catered to when we migrate to the GraphQL API as well. So some technical findings that we found was the logging. Obviously, we had a logger configured already, and obviously many of you who worked on Node.js or any logging tools, you'll know about Winston. So we had it configured Winston, which was very specific to our application needs, and we wanted to leverage the existing logging mechanism. We didn't want to do a change to the logging because obviously it's not something that needs to change when you have a new endpoint or a GraphQL. It's something that can be generic throughout your application. So we wanted to maintain and not touch it at all. We want to reuse it. Then coming to the session management, which is the most important aspect in this when you are basically migrating an API. So obviously the most popular pseudo authentication mechanism, OAuth is what even our Node.js API was following. So we didn't want to touch that. We didn't want to rewrite that. We didn't want to write a single line of code. A single line is an exaggeration, but we didn't want to basically do a complete makeover of our session management. So like I said, we wanted to rely on the existing authentication model around OAuth, and we wanted to when you have OAuth, there are multiple ways where you can handle the JWTs. So we were relying on a cookie-based authentication model, and we were parsing the JWTs in our Node.js API. So we wanted to continue with that. We didn't want to tinker around with that even a little bit. And then the third bit, I've covered logging, session management, then came the monitoring. Now, anyone who's worked in a big organization or who's built an enterprise API would relate to this, that you have multiple monitoring tools that your organization has chosen, and all your APIs need to basically hook onto these monitoring tools so that obviously you can record and instrument your APIs. So we didn't want to touch this even a single bit. So if we have a Node.js server running, we have a monitoring agent running on that Node.js server. We wanted to stick to that. We didn't want to make a single change to that. We want to reuse that. And obviously, since we had a Node.js API and our monitoring tool was already recording our Node.js API, we also wanted to explore opportunities where, since we are moving to a new paradigm, I can call it a paradigm shift from the REST-based API to a GraphQL-based API. We also wanted to explore more tools around where we can basically visualize our GraphQL schema and monitor our GraphQL schema in a much better way than what we were doing already, or maybe even use the existing tools that we have, like the existing monitoring tools, and see how we can make the best use of them as well to visualize our GraphQL APIs. So this this is kind of a pre-climax, but I think so. What we decided, and the tool that was the best for our that fit best to our needs was Apollo. I think it's very. I think it's the most used GraphQL client that is used in the industry right now, and it is the most popular one as well. So we chose to go with Apollo for multiple reasons, which I'll talk about in the subsequent slides. But yes, Apollo came to our rescue and made things simpler for us. Now, having said that, how did it do that, and what were the different things or the toolkit that or the approaches that we followed to make our migration smooth? So we defined a migration toolkit. This is basically the most important tools that aided us in our journey towards migrating. When I say migrating, I say that with caution. It's not basically rewriting, it's basically making best use of what we already had, and then using additional tools so that we can adopt GraphQL in an iterative manner. So these are, I mentioned four here, which were the most important in a part of our toolkit and which helped us in our journey to the migration. Apollo Server Express is a middleware which can be used with an Express server. Swagger-to-GraphQL is again an npm package which basically does a good conversion from your Swagger file to your GraphQL schema. It can generate your GraphQL schema given the Swagger file, and also the coming a bit to the testing and the monitoring bit. So we relied on Apollo Server testing for our integration testing and unit testing of the Node APIs, because it was the most, I mean, since you're using Apollo Server already, it's easier to use tools which basically revolve around that ecosystem itself. So Apollo Server testing was one of those for our testing purposes. And then there's Apollo Studio, which is basically a monitoring, you can call it a monitoring tool, which basically visualizes performance and gives you many metrics which you can reason with and which help you in the basic orchestration of your API. So diving a little bit more into what I just covered. So how did Apollo Server Express? So at the end of the day, if you remember my first slide and the breaking it down into multiple 6 facets or blocks, we had some things that we wanted to consider, right? So if you see how Apollo Server Express helped us was, we had an existing Node.js server running in production. We had it containerized, we had infra set up for it, we had all that running. Now we didn't want to basically again invest our time into infra configuration, router configuration, and things like that that come with any new API setup. So what we did was, Apollo Server Express is a middleware which works well with your Express servers. So what this helped us do is, we added the GraphQL endpoint. As you know, GraphQL is just a single endpoint, and you have different queries and mutation that you pass in the request body. So similarly, what we did is something similar. So we use the existing Node.js server itself, and we just hooked on Apollo Server Express so that we can use the new GraphQL endpoint as part of the existing Node.js infrastructure. With this, there came many other advantages. Session management, like I mentioned, we reused ours because previously also session management was a middleware. Like someone who's worked on an Express server, you know that everything is middleware driven. So we had a session management middleware. So we leveraged that. We just basically hooked it on into our request cycle, and we just reused that. We didn't have to tinker much with it. Then monitoring agent, since it's the same server that's running, didn't configure a new server or a new infrastructure. We reused the existing monitoring agents. And then the logging middleware as well. Like I mentioned, with the middleware approach, we had the logging mechanism also written as a middleware. We just had to, obviously, like I said, we wanted to minimize. So in this case, we just had to make some basic changes around reading the GraphQL error responses sometimes and massaging it in a way which our logger can understand. That was the only, I would say, the adaptation that we did. But apart from that, the reusing of the existing logging middleware was very smooth. So Swagger to GraphQL now, people who have, who know about this tool would have actually wondered in my first slide itself that why do we even need to have a 20-minute talk on this topic when we can just use Swagger to GraphQL and just immediately migrate our existing Node.js endpoints to GraphQL schema and just start using it. Yes, that's a valid point, but also when you have an existing Node.js endpoint, which is legacy in its nature, when I say legacy, I'm not saying that it was not built perfectly, but obviously with changing times, with changing performance requirements, it had to adapt to the new attributes we needed and the new orchestration that we needed, because at the end of the day, our Node.js server was an orchestration layer, which I didn't cover what I meant by that. Basically, what it was doing was it was talking to multiple microservices and serving the response. It was aggregating all the responses and serving it to our front end application. So similarly, the Swagger to GraphQL endpoint, Swagger to GraphQL npm package helped us with that. So what we did was, since it was iterative, every endpoint that we wanted to migrate to the GraphQL schema, or we wanted to improve its performance. So what we did was we first fed it through the Swagger to GraphQL and generated the schema. So Swagger to GraphQL also, I mean, this is one of the online IDEs that you can find online, that where you can just key in a existing schema and it will generate a relevant GraphQL schema for it. So Swagger to GraphQL has an online ID which you can leverage. So on the run, you just upload the Swagger file and it will generate the GraphQL schema. Now, once we had the GraphQL schema, we obviously wanted to refine it further, because what was built in the legacy API, there might be a lot of improvements that we can do on it. So we wanted to have more control over that refactoring. And hence we basically use Swagger to GraphQL as a helping hand, but it wasn't the solution which basically removed the need for any other activities that we needed during the migration. Now, coming to the third facet, or the third tool with as part of the migration toolkit, it is the Apollo server testing. Like I mentioned, we used Apollo server to solve our problem. So Apollo server testing has a very good documentation around how you can leverage its test client to do the integration testing and the unit testing easily. So, and also with it, it gives other constructs as well. For example, mock lists. So we had a lot, obviously we had a lot of fields which were lists, and if you want to easily mock it, so mock list is one of the constructs that's part of the Apollo server testing tool. So yeah, Apollo server testing is something that we introduced early in the journey. So we followed a TDD approach. So what it helped us do was it eased our unit testing and integration testing, and obviously we wanted to test more and not land into trouble. So Apollo server testing was the solution that came to our aid. And coming to the last tool in the toolkit, the Apollo Studio. So like I said, there are many things that I can cover in Apollo Studio, but easier metrics tracking and eased tracking schema changes, these are two things that we basically used it most for. So obviously metrics tracking is very important, and Apollo server, or Apollo Studio rather, does it really well. So I will not delve into the details. I think the Apollo Studio documentation is good for that. I think everyone should take a look at that. And also tracking the schema changes when, like for example, when you're in a migration journey, when you're refactoring, we wanted to see if you're making any changes in a commit to a given field, how often is that happening. So that was basically necessary to give us an idea whether we were making too many changes, and whether when we were doing the release we wanted to take that extra care into testing it. So tracking the schema changes is one feature that we used it extensively. So having spoken about the journey, the toolkit, it's also important to put front what the impact was on our team. So basically, like I said, the journey towards the GraphQL endpoint and having it in production was very swift. We had it up and running in the first release itself. So we didn't have to do many hassles around the infra and the router config. And we were also on a journey where we were refactoring our front end or the client application, and we introduced Apollo client. So when you have Apollo client and Apollo server working together, so it reduced some flakiness around our retry mechanism and our caching mechanism. So Apollo client, as people who worked on it would know about that. So these two tools together helped in a lot. Debugging became easier. Obviously, people who worked with GraphQL ecosystem would realize that it's much more developer friendly when it comes to uh, basically having the errors. This is a controversial opinion, but yeah, like I felt that the error handling was much more smoother in our journey when we switched to Apollo server. Um, and then obviously tracing the faulty service. When you have an orchestration layer, it's very important to trace which is the source of the problem. Let's say you are deriving data from 4 microservices, so it's very important to understand which is the source of the problem if something goes wrong. Now, we had that mechanism previously, but tracing it was difficult. So with Apollo and obviously the graphical structure of GraphQL, this became much more easier because we had adopted a schema which was graphical in nature. So basically pointing out to a field which was the problem causing child was easy. And we did basically analysis as well, 3 to 4 months into the journey. So we basically found that the errors that used to arise because we had some schema discrepancies where when I say schema discrepancies, our Node.js API had defined something in the Swagger, but what was returned was not valid. So because of the type system that GraphQL brings along, those kind of discrepancy errors came down by 50%. And also the number of errors that came down due to intermittent failure. Now, these happen obviously when you have multiple microservices and you are hitting them, and let's say the microservice for some reason it fails during that call, and your actual response depends on 4 other microservices as well. So in that case, what happens is if one of them fails, tracing it, and you basically fail out the entire response. So now with, like I mentioned, the point around the retry mechanism, so introduction of that reduced our bugs. We realized that that was the main reason for most of our failures, and that reduced it by a massive 80%. And also the last point, which is the most important point, if anyone is looking to adopt GraphQL, not just migrate to GraphQL, but adopt it from scratch. So there was a survey done for developers who worked on the GraphQL setup in the team. So 80% said that it improved their developer experience, multiple aspects to it, like debugging, coding, ease of use, things like that. 7% said that it was still the same, and 13% said that they don't have enough data or enough days of working on the GraphQL setup to come to a conclusion. But still 80% felt that there was a massive improvement, which is a big jump, I felt. So yeah, so that is the impact, and that is it. So this is about me. If you want to follow me, this is my Twitter handle, my LinkedIn page, and I have a GitHub page as well. So yeah, you can follow me at any of these relevant links, and that's about it. Thank you.
Adopting GraphQL in a legacy API, or perhaps a better way to describe it, iteratively migrating to an orchestration layer. Pranay, that was fantastic. I really appreciate you taking the time, not only to create that, but to share it with us. It's super compelling to me.
Thank you.
I think, there was a lot there, and you and I spoke about it a little bit, but I'd love to dive in a little more and discuss it. The problem that you described wasn't just a technical problem. There was a business component as well, and I'd love for you to share a little more with us on how you approached that problem and how you thought about the balance between the two.
Yeah, so what we decided from day one as an approach to the problem was not treat it, like I said, as a technical only problem, because usually migrations tend to go down that loophole or a rabbit hole. So what we did was we wanted to take business into confidence from day one, and we wanted to show them the incentive of doing this, the advantages of doing this. That's when your product and your API will grow into a less flaky or a more performant API, in this case, a GraphQL API. So from day one, what we did was, as you saw on the slides as well, we broke it down into 2 particular sets of problems. The most important one being the business problem, so that the business is aware in a way that, okay, this is what the incentive for them or the product in a holistic way is going to be. So in that sense, we made sure that we define, okay, if we are doing this migration, it's going to be an iterative process. We are not going to block business for very long during the migration journey. It has to be up and running as
Right.
soon as possible, and the advantages need to be visualized as soon as possible. So that's the journey we took, and I think that's what led that traction and made it faster instead of just treating it as a technical only challenge.
It's really, I mean, it's such an important tip. And, I think maybe for me, one of the most compelling pieces was that sort of the final bullet, right? The impact. Dev experience was 80% improved, 7% the same, and the 13% couldn't say. But, this whole conference has become sort of thematic around improving developer experience. And it feels like that stat alone, beyond uptime, beyond the ability for things to work, things that are kind of given, like that stat alone is really powerful.
And I think a lot of that was linked to the decision we made on why we chose GraphQL. If you see, the most important thing from a technical standpoint for us was we wanted something that was opinionated.
Yeah.
Not only GraphQL, in our case, Apollo added to that, but having an opinionated architecture removes a lot of the decisions that you end up making within a team, and then they don't scale. So when you have an opinionated framework which is used by the community, and the challenges and the problems and the solution have already been solved by the community as a whole, in this case for Apollo server in our case, so that helped. So that basically what it meant was debugging was much more faster. Previously
Right.
we had a legacy Node.js API which was built in school. In this case, since the community has solved a lot of the problems already, debugging was faster. And obviously, there's no two way of saying this. The GraphQL development, API development experience is much better than when you compare it to the old legacy way. So yeah, that led to an improvement in the development experience drastically, as you could see from the number.
Absolutely. Improved developer experience by migrating to an orchestration layer, but truly treating a technical problem as a business concern. Like, those are fantastic takeaways for all of us. Thank you so much for coming, for sharing, so openly, and for taking time to answer questions as well. We appreciate it immensely.
Thanks.